April 15th, 2022. It is, I suppose, my second video today. The first one being one of those talking head videos, which I did as a screen capture this time instead of as live streaming, because I wanted to have a very pristine view of my Windows desktop, which you really can't get if you start by live streaming to YouTube, because you at least need your browser open. And in my workflow, that requires me to open a browser in Virtual Desktop 3 ahead of time, start the streaming there, flip back to screen 1, and use a keyboard shortcut to set it to start doing the live casting. But that already has a little clutter of programs running, icons showing. As it turns out, I couldn't even reduce that last one of the screen recorder. I'm sure I could have if I looked in the settings, but I got it to a point where my goal of capturing the very pristine 7 virtual desktop environment where I use screen 1, 2, and 3 for very given purposes, and 4, 5, 6, 7, and whatever else I have to add for excuse me, for whatever comes up. Those are sort of wild card virtual desktops. And I did this inspired by the fact that in helping my wife, Nat, have a similar Vim editing experience as I have on a daily basis, 24/7, really. I have Vim going and I'm typing something into a file, usually the same file for life. Sometimes other files when it's code or different websites, but always Vim. And it's a very different way of thinking. It's adjusting to rules and habits that aren't in our everyday life for any other reason at all. Vim is wholly unique if you're not already, especially if you're not already a command line interface user, a CLI user. So there's a number of nuanced things to get over. And as part of that whole experience, for myself primarily, but I'm trying to sort of communicate it to people, I open a Linux terminal, a Microsoft shell, Microsoft terminal. I guess in the Microsoft store it's called Microsoft Terminal, but what it is it's terminal software, just like PuTTY or many of the TTY programs. It's one of those, but it's an official one from Microsoft, and it's got a tabbed environment, so you could have an old school Windows DOS-COM shell window in one tab, a PowerShell in another, the Windows subsystem for Linux in another. And when you go full screen with such a Windows terminal, it's a completely full screen experience. All distraction is removed. It covers your taskbar at the bottom. It covers, any of the notification things that happen. So it's a completely focused environment, which is a gift, which, sometimes you have to go looking for special software to give you the in the flow or in the zone experience, because all other software somehow or other lets the interruptions of modern day operating systems and life in at you. So the standard now standard, it took a while to get there, and this is one of the great gifts of Microsoft, because as much as I like to poke fun at Microsoft as being, a classic megacorp that no matter how benign and altruistic and, promoting of the free and open source cause they are also still in it for the profit, right? It's not a one-sided deal. So everything about their products and their approach to allowing you to have Linux is ultimately to have you rent your Linux cloud machines from Microsoft Azure. In fact, one of the drop-down menu options on Windows Terminal, which is completely worth using, is an Azure option to get you into an Azure terminal. It's like, hey, you can use Linux here on your local machines for the Windows subsystem. Now you can use that same Linux out in the cloud through Microsoft Azure. You just choose a different tab in Windows Terminal. It's very, very clever. So these things are working at extremely high strategies. And, I like to give people warnings about that. However, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. These are precious gifts, the Windows Terminal. A lot of people badmouth the, cheerleading of the Windows Terminal in that other programs have been around forever doing this and they weren't touted as extraordinary. Well, it's because it's standard now. It's from Microsoft. It's not pre-installed though. I wish it were pre-installed. Same with Linux. Linux is not pre-installed. Microsoft's or Windows, the Windows operating system's ability to have Linux running side by side with itself is built into Windows. But even for that, even to use it with the proper resource management capabilities of your hardware, in other words, under the hypervisor, you have to activate the hypervisor. I forget exactly what the step is called, but when you're on Windows 10, you had to specifically do that before you were running Windows Subsystem for Linux 2, which has enhanced features, different networking context, better performance, better integration with the Windows file system side. So files and data flows more readily between the Windows and the Linux side with the WSL2 version, but to get it running properly on Windows 10, there were some hoops you had to jump through. So, when Nat expressed interest in doing Vim old school for journaling, which does my heart warm, I love an opportunity to share this. And she's on Windows 11 because it was what was pre-installed on her laptop. So, starting out on Windows 11, it was an opportunity for me to see what the WSL experience was like. How many hoops must you jump through to get Ubuntu in a Windows terminal? Question mark. And as it turns out, it's not very many hoops at all. By the time you're done with the first command that you type in, you have Ubuntu running in a terminal. What terminal it is the only remaining problem. So you have one more install to do. So after you open any of the command line thingies in Windows, so I suppose it could be a COM, a DOS COM shell. Never been a great name for it. Some people call it the command shell. So you type the Windows logo in the lower left in the start bar, you type COM, it's the thing that comes up, right? It's the non-enhanced shell, because the better version or the enhanced version is the PowerShell. So you can load either a COM shell or a PowerShell, and then type WSL space hyphen install. I think it's install. Yes, because it's not on your machine yet and you want it. WSL space -- install. It not only will, as it seems, turn on virtual machine mode, hypervisor mode, so it switches your whole hardware's, your whole CPU's running context, which is good, which is fine. It provides opportunities for supervisor tasks to have privileged management of sub-operating systems. So it can do, stupid memory tricks like expand the size of a hard drive or memory for what you need on the fly, which you could never do with real hardware because, well, if you have it, it's on when you boot. But with virtual machine-like technologies, you can adjust your resources, reallocate on the fly. So you're activating that capability, which is normally not turned on for a number of reasons. It's overhead, it does slow your system down some tiny little bit. And also it's a surface area, it's a hacking vector. You wouldn't want to have all that extra equipment running when you don't really need it. So it's turned off by default, and you used to, under the Windows 10 version of doing this process, you had to go into Windows features that are normally turned off and activate that feature with a little check mark. And not until then could you upgrade your WSL1 instance to a WSL2 instance with it succeeding properly. You could try to, but I think after a much too long of a wait for the conversion process, it would say it failed and it would prompt you to turn on the hypervisor feature. So under Windows 11, it's all smoothed down. WSL space -- install. And it also goes ahead and downloads Ubuntu. I believe it's 20.04, the latest long-term service release. And I don't know if it's the graphics version or not. I don't know if it installs the GNOME desktop. That will be interesting to find out. But what I do know is by the time that's done, you still are one, card short of a full hand. Is that the right term? You need the Windows Terminal. And then when you go to the Microsoft Store, you type in Windows Terminal, there's two versions. There's a stable branch, and then there's a experimental branch, advanced features branch. So I go with the advanced features branch. There's a lot of interesting movement here in the Windows Terminal. I was doing this back in the day when settings just gave you a JSON file that you could edit with the editor of your choice. Of course, it prompted you to do VS Code, but I would edit my settings file for Windows Terminal with Vim. I was probably one of a handful of people who set the default to be that. So whenever I chose settings from the drop-down menu of Windows Terminal, Vim would pop up with that JSON file loaded into it. Vim didn't do me any favors with JSON. It's probably not the best. It's one of the places where you probably should use VS Code. Yeah, okay, so I'm serious about helping the world in what humble ways I can these days. And there's probably no better way in my toolbox than helping people get on to old school Vim. In a larger context, getting onto Linux, Python, and Git as well. So the whole picture is Linux, Python, Vim, and Git. I think that's a platform that'll be with you for a long time. I think that there is no expiration date if that's your tool set. Now, it's a little bit broad, I'll tell you. Saying Linux, well, what do you mean Linux? It's System D under Linux. Linux has a way where you can step in and take control of a machine just by putting text files in the right place. So, on startup, it'll run the files you tell it to. It'll make sure that program is running by checking every N amount of times. And I usually set it to 5 seconds. You don't need to tie up too much of the computer's resources to make sure a thing is running. And that thing which is running can be a .py file. And that .py file can be using the sched module, the built-in sched module for scheduling from Python, or it could be using a third-party package like pip install schedule, so which just has an API for humans for scheduling. It's one of those for humans types of packages, which takes something that the standard library could let you do perfectly well and takes the tedium out of it, because the standard library is supporting all the edge cases with a usually object-oriented API and sort of pass-throughs to what the operating system allows in terms of operating system services and such. So when you use a pip install schedule, you can say, do this on every Monday, do this on every Tuesday, do this every other day, only allow it in these time windows, period, or exact scheduling, that sort of thing. So, poof, what do you need? There's your first genie. Forget web development for a moment, just for a moment. The idea is to step in and take full control of your hardware to great effect. So, there's going to be experimental development, which is a separate story. But before I can tell you that story about Jupyter Lab in a web browser, I have to tell you this story about Linux, Python, Vim, and Git kind of stripped down. And then what led me to tell that story is that I'm jumping to Linux and Vim to help get my wife up and running with the same journaling approach that I use. So, you're never going to have anything that looks quite like using Vim under Linux, unless you are using Vim under Linux. It's like the look of hackers in movies, right? When you see a hacker suddenly do all these miraculous things on a screen, you know, they're usually using one of a handful of packages. Vim is one of those. Vim is one of those really old school packages you'll see pop up in the movies from time to time when people are doing something really impressive. Well, wouldn't you like that to be a part of your life? Just part of your real everyday skills. You do this as you would drive, as you would write, as you would do any of the other multitude of things humans have taught themselves to do, which you're not born with. It's a time-won skill through practice and through a lot of resiliency. Oh my goodness, resiliency. The point-and-click interface, which was innovated on Lisp hardware from such companies as Xerox in their Park, Wonderland, Skunkworks development thing, and lots of companies had these things, and real industry products came out of these things. Non-home computers, but large computers that got hooked to such things as typesetting equipment, photocopiers, nearly the same thing, right? These were usually having something to do with creating print output. And computographic, things that existed before computers started having computers hooked onto them. And Lisp computers, usually running a Lisp type operating system on Lisp hardware, was running the show. Very proprietary stuff, but this was stuff like the Xerox Star operating system. So the hardware was a Xerox machine. It was a photocopier. The computer that was connected to it was a Xerox Star, and it let you do all this computer control stuff you might imagine needing to do with a photocopier. And that had a point-and-click operating system and a mouse connected to it. And then that fateful day that Steve Jobs came touring through Xerox Park, saw that, and poof, you had a Macintosh. First, you had the Apple Lisa, which was like a suitcase version of what later we came to know as the original design of the Mac, the cute soda can design, I think I've heard people call it, the fish aquarium design. It's a neat little cute thing that you see in Bloom County comics. They had a spoof of it. The BMO character in Adventure Time is loosely based on it. It's a very classic look. But that was taking the point-and-click windowing operating system as innovated by the Lisp people at Xerox Park and, throwing it onto a Motorola 68000 based computer with nice, square, sharp, black and white pixels on a beautiful screen, really showing Steve Jobs' uncompromising approach to the visuals of the thing, the typography of it. Whereas Commodore with the Amiga computer was like, throw it on a TV and let it flicker. Those pixels don't need to be square. Very different mentality, but boy, could the Amiga play great video games. And the original Mac was good at, drawing little checkerboard box pictures for, over $2,000. So, very different approaches, and I happened to be on the Amiga in those days. And the value of being on the Amiga is, whereas the Mac was super stable, high quality, top-notch QA, the Amiga crashed all the time. All the time. With its multitasking was the, quickly learned presumption everything could just freeze. Not one of your apps, not just a frozen mouse that you might be able to recover from through a terminal or something, but a complete, catastrophic, glorious system freeze. They called it the Guru Meditation, because boy, did you need to learn to meditate like a guru, to not be angry over your lost work, and waiting for the process of restarting, which was no faster in those days than it is today, just because it was coming off of a floppy disk, the grinding, the waiting. So Guru Meditations, the big red flashing box, very unprofessional, but it was a hacker's computer. The person who made the Atari 2600, which some people might know as the Atari VCS, or some people might know is that first real video game in people's homes back in the mid-70s. That person who made such games possible at that price point is the same person as who made the Amiga computer possible at its price point. Such miraculous capabilities for the day. But it did it at a price, and that price was stability. The type of operating system it used was called a preemptive multitasking system, where one thing could interrupt the next. Not a cooperative or some of these other things that are out there, but preemptive. Things cut each other off, take over the resources, and then hand off to each other. And it was really the formula without memory protection. So the Amiga in those days never really got memory protection. It was at odds with this same thing that gave it this almost fantasy level of performance that you saw reflected in games. So that was a two-edged sword. You want this performance, you get crashes. So you tried to do productivity things on the Amiga, it still crashed. It crashed a lot. Page stream, I did desktop publishing on the Amiga, flickery screen and all. And it wasn't bad, but it was very compromising. So on the one hand, it was very compromising. Non-square pixels, flickering screen, crashes. On the other hand, you got tremendous value for the money. When it was performing, its performance was great. You got multitasking, an animation like no one else had for like another 10 years, and arguably like 15 or 20 years, and arguably some of these things it's only just catching up on now. So one of the reasons I'm very reinvigorated on computers and operating systems and muscle memory, and it as a obsolescence-proof tool right now, is that virtual desktops have sort of settled down with a similar behavior across all three major platforms. Windows, Mac, and GNOME, KDE, what have you, Linux desktops, all have a way to create virtual desktops. You can switch between those virtual desktops, usually left and right across horizontally oriented ones, with a keyboard combination. That's the same across all three major platforms. That's just like with the Amiga, this keyboard combination called Amiga N that let you cycle through the screens at like as fast as you could do it, in one redraw of the monitor, a new app was on the screen. And that feeling had not been captured on the Windows or the Mac or the Linux platform. Linux more than others because it had virtual screens going back to AT&T System 5 Release 4. Anyway, there's a lot of sub-stories here, but I'll try and stick to the main story. Likey virtual desktop, so much so that I base my habits, my daily workflow around it, relying on them. Windows 10 has a wonderful animated effect to switch between virtual desktops. They actually outdid the three-fingered swoosh of the Macintosh. So the Mac had it first. I forget what they called it exactly. So they had some fancy word for it. But you used a 3-finger swoosh on the trackpad to go left and right. So there's only 2 things wrong with that. It's a very insider-like thing to know to do, to use a 3-finger swoosh. And it's on a trackpad, a very particular implementation of hardware for daily operation. But it swooshed at exactly the speed your hand went. It was a magical experience, so Apple got there first. Windows eventually caught up, and they did exactly the right animated effect bound to a keyboard shortcut. A good feeling one that also worked on the Mac and on Linux desktops. So suddenly we've got a winner. Keyboard combination, left-right on virtual desktops. Now you can take the previously mentioned Windows terminal under the freshly installed Windows subsystem for Linux, put it in full screen mode for focus, run Vim, start editing a text file presumably that you can keep for life now as your journal. That's your way of practicing Vim. You're on Vim, you're on Linux, it's full screen and exactly the same feeling experience as it would be on a Linux machine, on a headless Linux machine, a cloud server, what have you. You're starting to get the Linux experience. And so that's what I wanted to talk about in this video. It's actually far more achievable, something that was aspirational on Windows 10 because of all the extra hoops you had to go through for WSL2, to being something that can just be done. You sit down, you say, I'm going to run Linux. On Linux, I'm going to reach Linux through a full screen terminal. So that's installing Windows Terminal from the Apple Store. The second thing you have to do after you install Linux, which installs Ubuntu automatically. It's really quite remarkable. It uses the login that you gave it, so that when you open a terminal and you open a terminal to the Windows subsystem, poof, you're logged in. You can CD to your journaling directory, type vim your journal name, use command line completion to make that easy, and you're in business. Humble first step. Humble first step. That old school world is more accessible today than it's ever been. And the iron is hot. And someone has to teach people how to get there, how to have the resiliency. Because, I was talking about with the Amiga and that resiliency. If you're not used to things not working the way you expect, or, it's not going to crash anymore. The Amiga's crashing is not an issue. With Vim, it's purely things not working the way you expect. You have to be in a really resilient, ready to accept new patterns kind of mindset. And when you do, you can start to use Vim on a daily basis for journaling. You can make it your blogging software. You layer Git into the picture, and if you wanted to, you could do web publishing, that same technique. Now, I wouldn't advise that for your journal, but you could have one directory over here for your journal, another directory over here, where every time you git commit, it publishes automatically to a github.io location, GitHub Pages in other words. I do that with a number of repositories. So daily journaling in Vim leads into actual web publishing, and thing leads into thing leads into thing, and pretty soon you can do scheduled tasks for yourself under Linux. You can do web development, run little web servers that you can reach in your own home, inside your own firewall on your local area network, and all kinds of interesting tricks, all these things that are aspirational, these thoughts that occur to you, if only I were a developer or whatever, just become a natural part of your daily capabilities, a lot like speaking. And literacy. is taking on a broader meaning these days. Unfortunately, it'll, be yet another thing separating the haves from the have-nots, but all the more reason to jump on the bandwagon. Python is the new lingua franca of tech. It's what's being included with Linux distros, replacing Perl for system administration type tasks more and more. And what gets installed by default with Linux is a very powerful driving force in the world of tech. If it's good enough, it's what computer science departments tend to jump onto, because availability and good enough, aligning with the principles of the comp sci curriculum. Python is even the default language taught at MIT, where Lisp was developed, and Scheme, one of the dialects of Lisp, was the computer science language automatically. Matter of pride, grown here sort of thing. But because of the pressures of whatever, industry, practicality, people wanting to use what they could turn around in industry and continue to use, Python has replaced Scheme in Comp Sci Introduction to Computer Science 101 at MIT. And I think it's still that way. I'll have to check my facts on that. But, talk about the tide turning, a language where white space matters and it doesn't have the Algol 60 BCPL derived curly braces to delineate blocks, and is an interpreted dynamic language as opposed to a compiled static typed language. Still having the kind of popularity it does and mainstream appeal. This is a gift. Even more, Linux is a gift, but Linux, honestly, once you learn enough to get and keep your stuff running, you don't really need to know much more. You need to learn how to launch a command under the command line, how to pass parameters in and out, how to pass the output of one program to the input of the other, and a few tricks like that, how to run things on a command line properly. The ins and outs of a few programs like ls for listing a directory, cd for changing your directory, pwd for print working directory, and you can get around and do stuff pretty well. You don't need to learn a lot of Linux. Python, you need to learn a lot of. You need to think in it. And Vim likewise, learn a lot of it, think of it, and Git just a little bit, depending on what you plan on doing. A lot of programs integrate Git into it, make it easy to use, but you should at least learn how to use it enough to have your own infinite undo, right? Isn't it nice to have infinite undo in all your code? Being able to branch your code and try experiments without it interrupting that one good copy that you know is working and you'd like to preserve. Forking and branching, all that stuff. So, Linux, Python, Vim, and Git, rah, rah, rah. And the wonderful experience I've had recently of helping my wife get on to Vim on Linux. Thanks for joining me. Hope to talk to you again soon.